Hello, I'm Tony Antolini. It's very nice to see you. We, of course, can't really see each other, but I'm pretending you're all here as you have been in past summers. Each talk that I give before these concerts will be approximately 45 minutes, and the musical examples will not be played in the middle of the talk. Instead, we have a new idea. We will have the examples, if there is time for much of that, at the end of each talk, and while the examples are playing, you will see pictures of the performers, so you can imagine who they are when you hear the actual concert. The music that you hear in this series will all be taken, the examples will be taken from the archives of Bay Chamber concerts. These are not samples taken from some other source. There are many resources that you can have at any time that you would like to add to your enjoyment of this experience, and they are free. Most of them are free. Never forget the great value we have of YouTube. YouTube performances include all kinds of wonderful videos where you can see the performers playing. There is, of course, also the subscriber series such as YouTube Music and Spotify, but you don't have to spend money on that if you don't feel like it. For those of you who are interested in a truly educational experience, if you use Google and type in the name of the piece, you can find sometimes, in many cases with this repertoire, the score, and you can watch the score as you listen to the music. It's a great way to sharpen your music reading skills. So I'm going to be gesturing to my assistant, whom you cannot see, but who would certainly deserve applause if you could give it, and that's Josie Davis. She is doing all of the production work for these presentations. Now, usually when we meet, we have questions and answers at the ends of these series. And I'd love to be able to have your questions, your comments, and so I'm giving you now on the screen an opportunity to see how to get in touch with me. You can email me, and if I understand the technology, you can hear my voice and see the slide at the same time. I'm also on Facebook Messenger, and even though we can't have live questions and discussion, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you and hear any suggestions you may have. Hello again. It's nice to have you with us for this performance coming up of music of Johannes Brahms and Maurice Ravel. Johannes Brahms, one of the great B's of the German music tradition, the other B's being Bach and Beethoven. This is not my own conception. You see it in all kinds of books, and it's supposedly ascribed to the conductor Hans von Bülow a long time ago. Since Brahms is sometimes not as familiar in terms of family history and social history, I thought I would take a minute or two to mention what his background is like. He was not a privileged person. In fact, compared to someone like Mendelssohn, his background is rather humble. His mother was a seamstress. His mother was 17 years older than his father. His father was his first music teacher. By the age of 10, he was showing signs of great promise as a pianist. And his teachers began to complain that he didn't practice enough. Well, he was already showing a great deal of interest in composition and would spend more time figuring things out that he wanted to write than he did with his piano practice. One of his teachers is largely responsible for Brahms's extremely wide musical style, and that was Edward Markson. Markson, as a keyboard teacher, made sure that Brahms knew the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. Now remember that Bach had been kind of forgotten for about 100 years after he died in 1750, and then he was very much brought back into prominence by Felix Mendelssohn. By the time that Brahms was exposed to the works of Bach, it's very clear from his own works that Bach's influence was very deep in what Brahms had to write. So, as a conductor, Brahms was also quite distinguished. He maintained this connection with classical music so that at the time, if you were to compare someone like Brahms with the more new wave composers, I'm thinking particularly of Richard Wagner and Franz Liszt, Brahms would have been viewed as a conservative. Now, these days, of course, all of it is considered, well, classical music. When you listen to a classical music station, you might hear an overture from one of Wagner's operas or a piano piece by Franz Liszt, and it would all be called classical music. But in that time, the innovators who were contemporary with Brahms were Wagner and Liszt. And Brahms was, in a way, kind of old hat, but he was a superb craftsman. When you look at his works, you can see that he really absorbed his lessons in counterpoint, because even though it doesn't sound like Bach, it has the same mark of craftsmanship that a composer like Bach would have insisted upon. And yet, it's romantic music, so it has a very highly emotional, expressive nature, which Baroque music doesn't really have in the same way. In this particular concert, you were going to hear the Sonata for Violin and Piano in G major, Opus 78. And this has a nickname, and a very deliberate nickname. It's called the Regen Sonata. Regen in German means rain, R-A-I-N, and it was composed during 2 summers when Brahms was on vacation at Prochach on Wörthersee. This is a beautiful resort place where he could relax, and so the music is a kind of evocation of being on vacation. Now, most people would go on vacation and read a book or go float around in a boat and go fishing or something like that. Brahms goes on vacation and writes a piece that is, in a way, a kind of diary entry of what it's like to be in a place that he loves so much. It's a 3-movement work, and the reason it's called the Regen Sonata is because the theme is the same as one of his songs called Regenlied, and it also comes up in another song which is not as frequently referred to, called Nachtklang. Nachtklang are sounds that you hear at night. Now, let's just take a moment to consider why Brahms would be quoting himself in this way. Brahms was a composer, of course, of very, very prominent piano music. He was an exquisite pianist himself. Orchestral works, like his symphonies, are considered top of the line for his period. He never wrote an opera, but he wrote a magnificent and extremely important choral work called the German Requiem. The German Requiem is probably his crowning achievement, and he chose the text for that from the Bible, chose them himself. And the point here is he also wrote volumes of wonderful songs. Now, these songs are for one singer and piano accompaniment, There are also some other songs, if you're interested in Brahms, that you might want to listen to that are for groups of singers and piano. There are two cycles that are particularly wonderful in that respect. Sometimes they're done by a choir, sometimes just by four individual soloists. So Brahms was a lover of poetry and loved to set poetry. So Regenlied was something that he had obviously enjoyed writing because he quotes himself later in this particular sonata. Now, another connection with a previous talk, and I hope you've been able to listen to the other talks because some of these other people that are mentioned here are discussed in greater detail in another talk. Here, I'm referring to Robert and Clara Schumann. The Schumanns were very close personal friends of Brahms, and Brahms was also a very close friend with a superstar violinist of his time named Joseph Joachim. Joachim figures prominently in helping Brahms with his violin concerto. The solo part, Brahms was not a violinist, so it was helpful to him to talk to this superstar, and you can kind of picture if he asked Joachim, could you do this, could you do this, would this be better, how would this sound? So this is the trio of people that influenced this piece. This Opus 78 includes 3 sonatas, so when you look for it, make sure if you're looking on one of the music servers such as Spotify or SoundCloud, make sure if you enter Brahms Opus 78, you have to specify G major to find the right one. The first movement, Vivace ma non troppo, fast, vivacious but not too fast, in 6/4 time. Now 6/4 time is a little bit unusual for an opening movement because instead of a standard 1, 2, 3, 4, you are defining what is called complex meter. 6 has to be divided into 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and Brahms was a great experimenter with rhythms, so he can get a lot out of a 6 because you could also go 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and listen for that. This is in sonata form. Brahms was, of course, conservative in that sense that he wrote music that conforms to the traditional 2 ideas, repeat the ideas, development, recapitulation. The middle movement, Adagio, slow, and then più andante, a little bit at a walking pace, then Adagio, again, this time 2/4 time. Here we're in the key of E flat major, and in the middle of this, we have another kind of coincidence, but perhaps not a coincidence. In a previous talk, I mentioned the funeral march that comes in a piece by Robert Schumann. Now, of course, you have to remember, Schumann and Brahms are very good friends. And Schumann had written that da-da-da-da-da. Now, this one doesn't sound like that. But isn't it interesting that these 2 friends both think of putting a funeral march in the middle of a chamber music movement? So think about that piano quintet, second movement, because they must have talked about it. Third movement. Now, here things get rather elaborate. This is in G minor, and it's a rondo. Again, as I've mentioned to you before, the rondo form is the idea where something keeps coming around. We call it an A idea, so A, B, A, C, A. The coda at the end of it finishes the piece off. There's a dotted rhythm motif from the rain song, which is especially evident, but it's heard throughout the entire work. So what I would suggest you do, if you really want to do your homework with this piece, find a recording of the rain song, Regenlied. And if I may suggest, one of the greatest interpreters of Brahms songs, if you have one of these fancy things like Spotify, find Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing Regenlied, and you will then play it several times so you get an idea of what the tune is, then listen to this piece, and you'll be able to discover, it's kind of like Where's Waldo? This tune comes all kinds of interesting places in this piece. Now, here, there is another element that I would like you to just keep in mind. There's a tragic aspect here. The piano accompanies the violin in this theme with a kind of pattern of raindrops. And I don't think it's too much to say that this piece is a meditation on grief, because as you know, if you've listened to a previous talk this summer, Schumann had died prematurely in a mental asylum and left Clara with a very large family. Brahms is a great friend of Clara's, and it's pretty clear that there is a confused relationship there, because he'd been friends with Robert, but now he's with Robert's widow, and she clearly counts on him for emotional support and, of course, musical support back and forth. That had already been established before Schumann died. So I have a couple of quotes here that are really interesting. Thomas Sangalli, the intimacy of yearning in this work is so essentially private that it could never have been intended for the concert hall, but only for the drawing room. In that sense that if it's in a big space, you can't really feel this emotional reaction to loss. Clara, who by now was 59 years old, writes to Brahms, "Your sonata arrived today, would have sent her a copy." And of course I played it at once and could not help bursting into tears of joy over it. That's really the best wrap-up I can give you of this piece. Now, a little bit about what's going on here in terms of the overall structure. If you listen to this without really studying it in structural detail, it sounds rather loosely organized. But Brahms was a very organized worker. You can kind of sense if you study it in detail, and a player would have to do this. You see that the craftsmanship is clearly there. It's a little bit surprising that it sounds loosely organized and in fact is very clearly organized. This recurrence of three notes in dotted rhythm that the violin begins with is a kind of trademark of the piece. So, Clara wrote to Brahms very late in his life. Joachim was here. That would have been the violinist who was so close to Brahms. Was here on the 8th, which would have been Robert's 80th birthday. Of course, he didn't live to that age. And for 2 days, we had a lot of music. We played the Regenlied Sonata again, and I was deeply moved by it. I wish that the last movement could accompany me in my journey from here to the next world. So think about these things as you listen to this wonderful work. The players in this are also very interesting. The violinist is Stefan Yakif, or Jakif, I'm not sure exactly how he pronounces it. As a person now in my late 70s, I'm always astonished when I see how much somebody has accomplished who was born so recently, and to me this is a youngster born in Boston in 1985. He has a very interesting background. His mother and father are both physicists. His mother is Korean, his father is of Ukrainian descent. That's how he gets this Ukrainian sounding last name, well actually first name as well. The mother, I believe, still teaches physics at Boston University, and the father, who is now retired, taught physics at MIT. His mother's father is a very famous Korean poet, and I'm not fluent in Korean, so I'm only going to guess that his name is P. Chun-deok. Now, Stefan has an interesting educational history, because often when you see these superstars, you think to yourself, well, they must have gone to a special school for prodigies and then gone to a conservatory and then another conservatory. Not at all. This kid started with Suzuki, which is where many, if not most, string students start. And then he went to a music school in Boston, the Longy School of Music. And while he was going there taking violin lessons, he was enrolled at Roxbury Latin School. Now, this is no conservatory. This is a very high-level public school in the Boston area. Then he did not choose to go to Juilliard or Cleveland Institute or someplace like that. He went to Harvard. And after Harvard, he went to New England Conservatory and got himself a master's degree. When asked, who is your role model, you'd think, well, he's a violinist. He would probably choose a violinist. No, his role model is the very distinguished Asian-American cellist Yo-Yo Ma. Now, here's the connection. Yo-Yo Ma also had the same kind of background. He also went through a liberal arts training at Harvard, and then, of course, was trained by some of the greatest cellists of his time. But his background is liberal arts. Stefan plays an instrument that I want you to admire, because you're looking at music history. The violin was built by Vincenzo Ruggieri of Cremona. Cremona is a town in Italy famous for its violins. This one is dated 1704, so imagine the insurance policy on that instrument. And the bow is a French one by François Nicolas Voirin, and we don't know the exact date, but we do know that it was sometime in the middle of the 19th century. Now, the other superstar in this performance is someone who has been at Bay Chamber a number of times, and at least for those of you who have been coming recently, the last 2 years we have seen Conrad Tao. If I had to choose somebody who is a living, walking example of a prodigy, this is the guy I would choose. Conrad was born in 1994. It just doesn't seem possible that somebody born that recently could do all the things he's done. If you don't believe me, just Google Conrad Tao and you'll get page after page of all the things he's done. Now, he and Stefan have a very interesting common background. Both of them have parents who are scientists. In this case, Conrad's parents, both of them were Chinese, from China, came to this country, got their PhDs at Princeton, and have taught science in various universities. Conrad is a triple threat. He is a violinist. In fact, when you Google him, you have to specify Conrad Tao violin, Conrad Tao piano, or Conrad Tao composer. He's well known for all three. That's not fair, isn't it? He got a big start on a show that still is very much around, and we've even had some alumni of Bay Chamber Music School who have been on From the Top. He was on From the Top. It's a radio show, by the way. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to get familiar with it. Conrad was on at age 13, and it was a very unusual performance, because when he was on that show, usually it's, well, here comes Conrad Tao and he's going to play the piano for you. In his performance, he played the violin and he played the piano, and he also played a piece that he had written. So triple threat at age 13. He went to Columbia in New York City and to Juilliard. Now, The final work that we want to look at today is a piece by Maurice Ravel. Now, Maurice Ravel has written a piece here that has a very interesting instrumentation involving harp. Now, the player in this picture is not the player you're going to hear, but I thought it would interest you to see what he looks like with one of his harp virtuosi. Ravel is a very kind of confusing character because he is now viewed as one of the great composers of the early part of the 20th century, and yet when he was at Paris Conservatory, he was an enfant terrible. They just didn't know what to do with him because he was an experimenter, and the conservatory in Paris in the early 20th century was very cut and dry. You learn the canon, you do your assignments, you write the music in imitation of Bach, in imitation of Chopin, and so forth. He didn't want to do that, so he dropped out. He wanted to innovate, so he would take ideas that interested him from the Baroque era. He started writing classical music in a new way, and during his time as getting a formative time as a composer, he began hearing more and more jazz played in France, and so you see a jazz element in his music. Now, poor Ravel is probably best known for a piece that some people love and other people hate, and this is called Bolero. It's the one that goes dun da 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 dun da 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 dun 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 da da da. Now, talk about an earworm. You get that in your head, you won't get it out for hours. However, that piece is definitely not, in my opinion, his best piece. It certainly was a very unusual piece for its time. He is the orchestrator of other people's works. He really knew the sounds and colors of the orchestra. He's like an experimenter with sound, the way some painters experiment with color and light. So a perfect example of that is a piano piece that I referred to in a previous talk, Pictures at an Exhibition by Modeste Mussorgsky. Pictures at an Exhibition was written as a piano piece, and Ravel had the brilliant idea, this is really good music, let's orchestrate it. And I think now it's probably even better known and better liked in Ravel's version than the original. He is labeled, along with his French colleague Claude Debussy, as writing Impressionist music. And neither he nor Debussy approved of this, but it's a borrowing of a term that was used in art, in painting, and in poetry that reflects the idea that instead of a literal representation of something, you get an impression of it. The best way to see what Impressionism is to look at the Impressionist painters. But these two composers, Ravel and Debussy, hated being called Impressionist composers. They never used this term. He is unusual in that he was the kind of worker who dealt with detail. So compared to someone, let's say, like Beethoven or Bach, where there's a huge output, this man's work is much smaller. A way of seeing this is if you go to a book that shows the manuscripts, what the handwriting looks like. It's fascinating. I really recommend you do this. Look at the manuscripts of someone like Beethoven, and you see the stormy personality and a measure all crossed off and an inserted idea in the margin. And you can even see where he broke his pen. He got so mad at himself because he didn't think it was working out well. Bach also was a great one for changing his mind about things. And you see a phrase crossed out and a substitute phrase. You look at Ravel's manuscripts and it's the most exacting tiny detail because he worked very slowly. He wrote no symphonies, he wrote no sacred music. His music is concentrated in chamber music, orchestral music, and some wonderful songs. Ballets, 2 operas, 2 piano concertos. Now, this piece is only 2 movements long, and it has a very strange origin. It's called Introduction and Allegro, but the introduction is really nothing more than a short introduction, so it's really a 1-movement piece with an intro. At the time, there were 2 competing companies in France that were building harps. One was called Pleyel, and the other was called Erard. So Pleyel wanted to show off their latest harp. Now you have to also remember, technology is changing pianos, but it's also changing harps. Pianos now, by this time, have metal frames. Well, so did harps. So Pleyel had designed this new chromatic harp. That means it plays all the white and black notes rather than a fixed scale in a fixed key. And so this Pleyel company commissioned Ravel's colleague, his competitor, Claude Debussy, to write a piece to show off this new harp with an orchestra, and that is the origin of the Sacred and Profane Dances written by Debussy in 1904. So, not to be outdone, the other harp company that had also built a new metal framed harp that could play chromatics said, let's commission Ravel to write a piece and we'll show off the Erard harp. So Ravel said, sure, I'll do that. Now this was the first example, this Erard harp, that you now can see quite commonly of a harp that has pedals. Now, if you've never gone up to one of these and asked for a demo, let me just explain briefly what the pedals do. It has nothing to do with loud and soft or the dynamics that a pianist uses pedals for. And it's also not like an organ where the pedals are actual notes you play of the bass line. The pedals on these harps change little mechanical things so that the strings can change pitch. So if all of a sudden, let's say you're playing a piece in the key of C, which has no sharps and flats, and you need some sharps, you push a pedal down and one of these little gizmos, like a kind of like a capo on a guitar, changes the pitch for you. So, the pedal harp was being introduced, and this piece was written to show it off. Keep that in mind as you listen to this piece. It's like a tiny concerto. And there is a local connection to this piece. The US premiere featured Carlos Salcedo. Now, if you've never heard of Carlos Salcedo, you don't know your Rockport history, because he founded the Salcedo Harp Colony right here in Rockport, where all these famous harpists came and studied with him. And it went on for years and years after he died with another distinguished harpist named Alice Chalfou. So, the introduction, as I said, is really not much. It's 26 bars. It's in G-flat major, so we're going to really show off how this harp can play in a weird key, because G-flat major is not a user-friendly key. It's deliberately showing off a user-unfriendly key. If you don't like G-flat major, think of F-sharp major. Try playing that scale on the piano and you'll see what I'm talking about. And it's marked très lent, which means very slow. Now we get to the major part of the piece. It's in sonata form, but you wouldn't necessarily notice that. The harp expands on the material that you heard in the 26-bar introduction, and the woodwinds, in this case, very interesting choice of flute and clarinet, expose this second theme with a string accompaniment. The development, and you wouldn't, as I say, you wouldn't necessarily notice that it's in sonata form because it isn't obviously in sonata form, but where it gets the loudest is the middle of the development. And then we have a very old-fashioned technique, again, a commercial idea here, to show off the harp. At the end of the movement, the harp plays a cadenza. That's like a closing section that is a solo for one instrument. Then the original ideas are brought back. There's a little coda, and the piece ends. The entire duration of the piece is 11 minutes. It's been nice having you visit with me, and I hope you enjoyed all of these concerts this summer. Thank you.